Hello, everyone. Happy Tuesday. It is almost noon, and we are going to go ahead and get started in a couple of minutes. So just get comfortable, get your coffee or your lunch, and get settled, and I will be back on very shortly. All right, so it is a few minutes past noon, so we are going to go ahead and get started. Thank you, everyone, for participating in another Impact Tuesdays. I am Jennifer Krishka, CEO of the Jewish Women's Foundation of the Greater Palm Beaches. We are a feminist social change foundation that is dedicated to advancing the status of women and girls in the United States and in Israel. Today, we are joined by two wonderful women from the Human Trafficking Legal Center, which is based in DC. I am going to go ahead and we're having a few technical difficulties today, but we will manage. Just a couple of housekeeping issues as always. So one, we just moved our office space, and so there is a little bit of furniture being put together in the background, so there might be some drill sound, so hopefully you won't hear too much of it, but I apologize in advance if that is the case. Aside from that, we of course always want to take questions, and we prefer to hold the questions to the end of the webinar, so about 15 minutes to 1. I will open it up to anyone who has questions, but feel free to submit questions through the Q&A feature, which is located either at the bottom of your screen or possibly at the top right-hand corner, depending on if you're on a tablet or a computer. So again, feel free to submit your questions throughout the webinar, but we will try to hold them into the end because it's possible that Alex or Martina will address your question at some point during the webinar. So I want to welcome Alex and Martina. Thank you both for being here. Martina, I think your microphone is muted.
Yes, thank you for inviting us.
Yes, so happy to see you. It's been a while.
A long time.
But we're really happy to have you here with us today. I know that a lot of our trustees and other women in the community are really interested in trafficking as an issue. And I think that, you know, the work that HT Legal does is so important, and it's just such an interesting approach to this particular issue. So Martina, you are the founder and also the president. So I thought, and Alex is a senior attorney with the organization. So I thought, Martina, we could start with maybe if you could tell us sort of why you wanted to create this organization, why you felt it was really important to do that.
Thank you so much. So before I start, I just want to thank you, Jennifer, for organizing this and for inviting us to participate. And I want to thank JWF for all the support that you've given us over the last 4 years. It's been immensely helpful in pursuing the organization's mission, which now is what I'm going to talk about. So I worked at Human Rights Watch for a long time and documented trafficking of women for forced prostitution and rape as a war crime, mostly in the Balkans and the former Soviet Union. And when I went into legal practice, I started doing pro bono trafficking cases at a big law firm, Jen & Block. And so for years, I did that work just as a pro bono lawyer, and then realized that every law firm needed to be doing pro bono work in this area. And there was no bridge between human trafficking non-governmental organizations and law firms with brilliant lawyers who were eager and willing and completely capable of doing brilliant legal work on these cases. So my partners at my law firm, when I was in Washington at the firm, they joked that I was the head of the Human Trafficking Practice Group, which existed only in my mind. So I thought every law firm has a capacity to do this work. So in 2011, 12, I left the firm and started an organization, the Human Trafficking Legal Center, that could provide pro bono referrals to large law firms. And Alexandra Levy-Yelderman, who's on the call with me today, has been with me literally since the very first day. So Alex and I really sort of created this organization from nothing together.
That's amazing. And Alex, welcome. Thank you for being with us today. So, I mean, I'd love to just give everyone on the webinar an idea of exactly what it is that you do, and then sort of how you do it.
So there are basically sort of three main strains of the work that we're doing. One is the really sort of heavy work of placing cases with firms. So non-governmental organizations that don't have lawyers, that do social work but not legal work, will contact us and say, look, we have a sex trafficking case, or we have a labor trafficking case, and we think that this person could use a lawyer. So the first strain is when those people are witnesses in criminal cases, and they really need lawyers in criminal cases when they're witnesses, and Alex can talk more about that as well. The second is victims who aren't ever going to have a criminal case. The feds just aren't going to prosecute. And so for those victims, really the only option is a civil case. And so we find lawyers who can bring civil cases against traffickers and against those who benefit to try and get some sort of compensation for victims who've suffered so much. And then third is a lot of the work that Alex is doing, which is heavy duty research to try and figure out where the system is failing victims so that we can do advocacy to fix it. So we think of ourselves a little bit as the Human Rights Watch of human trafficking, because a piece of the work is sort of heavy analytical research designed to fix major flaws in the system.
Sure. And so the work that you're doing is primarily in the United States?
We do work all over the world. And in fact, one of the things that we did that was partly sponsored by JWF was a guide for lawyers all over the globe on how to hold Americans and US residents accountable for going abroad to sexually abuse children. So there's a law that no one knows about and almost no one uses called the PROTECT Act, which says that if an American citizen goes abroad to sexually abuse a child, that American can be both criminally prosecuted in the United States and can also be subject to a civil case. And so we work internationally in that sense. And we have an international lawyer, my deputy director, Sarah Bessel, who travels all over the world and does training with lawyers on the ground. But the work that we've done with JWF has focused really heavily on flaws in the US system. Right? The US holds itself out as a model for the world, and the United States is really dropping the balls in some fundamental ways that Alex has researched.
Can you tell me more about that? Like in what ways do you think the United States is not doing, as much as it can be doing?
So the most recent report that we published with support from JWF is on the arrest and incarceration of trafficking victims to force them to testify in cases against the traffickers. So I'm going to hand the baton to Alex if I can, because Alex actually wrote that report. So Alex can give you some examples that really illustrate how the system is failing victims in the United States.
Thank you.
So Alex, you want to take it over?
Sure, yeah. So Martina mentioned this practice that I think is surprising to many, and shocking really, which is that courts will sometimes incarcerate or detain, order victims to be detained in order to force them to testify against their traffickers. In earlier research we did on restitution to victims, we figured out that this was maybe a bit of a problem. We didn't realize the depth of it. So just to give you a couple of examples, in a case called US v. Curtis, there was a kid, a 12-year-old, who the trafficker recruited her in front of a library. He told her that she was beautiful and essentially convinced her that she was in a romantic relationship with him, and immediately started to traffic her, force her to engage in commercial sex acts. And one of the things that we see a lot in trafficking cases is that the relationship between the victim and law enforcement will be very fraught. which is also a way in which we're failing, a sort of secondary or way in which our legal system is failing victims. But these relationships that are fraught, in effect, increase the bond between the victim and the trafficker. She, for instance, was arrested for prostitution and then returned voluntarily, so to speak, to the trafficker after she was released. This was her home. This was her family. This case is particularly notable because when the prosecutors were arguing that the defendant should be sentenced to a certain amount of time, and they were listing the harms that she suffered, in addition to talking about the harms that the direct injuries that the defendant caused to her, the prosecutors cited the fact that she was detained as part of the harm that the defendant caused. And that really it's not harm that the defendant caused. And that's important because it's harm that the prosecutors, the courts, that our legal system could have chosen not to inflict on the victim. That the defendant was sentenced to 6 life sentences. He was ordered to pay some restitution. Another case that is particularly notable, US v. Hunt. We have sort of a similar kind of background. The victim, I think, was 14 there. She had run away from her grandmother's home. She was a chronic runaway, and also a very fraught relationship with law enforcement. And she was detained also in order to testify against her trafficker, who she didn't want to testify against. In that case, when she testified at trial, I think at that point she was 15 maybe, her trafficker was representing himself in court, so he cross-examined her directly. So she was detained and forced to be cross-examined in court by her trafficker, and while she was still a child, underage.
Right.
And I guess the third case that I just want to highlight as an example, and there are certain commonalities, but each of these cases kind of, I think, highlights an important part of this issue. US v. Pruitt, the victim escaped from a juvenile home, and the defendant continued to communicate with her and told her that if she cooperated, he would kill himself, and continued to leverage her feelings towards him in order to prevent her from cooperating. So in the end, she was also detained.
I have so many questions. So I want to start maybe a little bit broad and then get to some of the more specifics about the work that you're doing. So based on what you're seeing and your knowledge of what's happening, let's say in the United States, what's the landscape like when we're talking about trafficking in terms of what we know of the number of victims? How often would you say that they're children versus adults? Can you maybe just like tell us more about sort of like what the specifics are around trafficking in general? Because probably, a lot of people who are listening to this webinar may not know very much about like the statistics or I think the reality of trafficking. I think that sometimes we see things about trafficking because the topic has gotten a lot more, publicity, and people are always shocked when I talk to them about trafficking, and they always find it difficult to believe that the issue is as significant as it's being presented. And so I'd love to hear from the two of you, since this is really what you do, kind of like what the reality is around trafficking.
So I think that's such a great question and so hard to answer because, there are really 3 kinds of trafficking in the United States under the US law. One is trafficking of adults into the sex industry by force, fraud, or coercion, right? So any adult who's in the sex industry because of force, fraud, or coercion is trafficked. If there's a child under 18, any child in the sex industry, in the commercial sex industry, is trafficked. There doesn't need to be any force, fraud, or coercion because children simply they can't consent. Right. And then the third, which is completely underreported, is trafficking for forced labor. And that's more common than people think. The other thing I think that people find shocking is that trafficking, particularly of children in the United States into the sex industry, is mostly US citizen children, right? When people hear trafficking, they immediately think that someone's crossed a border. But I think what has surprised everyone who's not sort of working so deeply every day in the field is that the cases that Alex just talked about, those cases are all U.S. citizen American children, as far as we can tell from the court dockets.
Mm-hmm.
And so there is this sort of intersection between children, as Alex mentioned, who, some of them have run away, some of them have been thrown out of houses by parents. And so those children are highly vulnerable to human trafficking. Now, one thing I should say is a friend of mine, Lou DeBaca, used to be the ambassador at the State Department in charge of the International Trafficking in Persons Office at State. And he used to call human trafficking a rigor-free zone, right? Because people throw out numbers and a lot of them are wrong. The New York Times has published numbers that are wrong. They've said that 400,000 children in the United States are trafficked into the sex industry, which is just not true. It's not that number. That's an estimate of how many children are vulnerable, not how many children are actually trafficked into the sex industry. So one thing that we've been trying to do is bring rigor to this field, and a lot of Alex's analytical work is bringing rigor. So in terms of criminal cases, and Alex should correct me if I'm wrong, but based on our own data, there were only 154 federal trafficking cases brought by prosecutors last year, and of those, only 10 were for labor. So if you're trafficked into forced labor in the United States, it's pretty much guaranteed that the perpetrator will not be prosecuted. If you are a child who's held in the sex industry, the likelihood of prosecution is higher because those cases are easier to prosecute, because you only have to prove that this is a child and that there was a commercial sex act. You don't actually have to prove that there was any force. So the prosecution numbers are low. And the other thing that Alex's research identified is that the number of people who are getting compensation in these cases, in the criminal cases where they should be getting compensation, it's mandatory under law. It's a tiny, tiny fraction of people who are actually being served by the justice system.
Okay. And just to clarify, so when you're talking about restitution, you're talking about money, right? So basically like damages that you're suing for against the trafficker that are then being given to the trafficking victim.
So there's two ways to do this. I mean, I've worked on human trafficking for more than 20 years. And what I have learned over the years is that trafficking victims can get therapy and then they can overcome the psychological harm. They can get job training and they can overcome some of the occupational sort of disadvantage that they have. But you can never recover from, a decade of having no earnings at all. And so one of the things that trafficking victims need, it's really simple. They need money. so Congress understood, and Congress put in the criminal law a provision that says that the prosecution is required to request in a sentence that the victim receive literally what the victim lost. So the idea in the criminal case is to make the victim whole. So in a labor case, it's easy. If I worked for 10 years and was paid nothing, I should get 10 years worth of minimum wage, right? And so that's the measure. In a civil case, which is the other way that we try and get compensation for victims so they can move on with their lives. In a civil case, it's a much broader range of sort of funding categories. So it's not just your back wages in a forced labor case, it's also punitive damages and contract damages and sort of a whole array of other damages. So the interesting thing that Congress did, which Congress does so many things badly, they actually did this one right. They decided that it would be wrong to calculate mandatory restitution, particularly for children, based on an hourly wage. There's no such thing as minimum wage for being held in the sex industry against your will.
Right.
So what they said was, we're going to calculate criminal restitution, which is different than civil damages, but we're going to calculate criminal restitution based on what the defendant earned. So if the defendant demanded $100 a sex act, and that child was performing 5 sex acts a day, then that child should recover in a criminal case $500 per day, multiplied by the number of days that child worked. a lot of these children in the sex industry have quotas. So they're required to provide their trafficker with an amount every month. So the restitution is literally that quota multiplied by the number of days they were held.
Mm. Oh. This must be very challenging work, I imagine. Having to, I mean, I'm sure there must be some kind of criminalization, but it's so awful to have to hear about, you know, children that are being treated this way.
Well, I mean, the people that I have sort of very profound respect for are the people who are doing the social work and the wraparound services following. I think you have grantees who do some of that work. We're sort of one step slightly removed as lawyers, literally trying to win cases in the courts, but certainly the trauma that those victims experience sort of spills over into every relationship. But Jennifer, there's some amazing success stories, really remarkable people. So cases that don't go to criminal trial sometimes end up in the civil court. And one case that was just featured on NPR is a case involving a woman named Lisa Riccio, who was held by a would-be trafficker in a hotel and abused in the hotel, and allegedly abused with the acquiescence and knowledge of the hotel owners. So we referred the case to WilmerHale, a big pro bono firm, and the law firm brought the case in Massachusetts in federal court. It was dismissed one time, it went up on appeal, they won on appeal, it went back down, it went back to trial. The victim testified in court before a jury on the very first day of the trial, and the case settled the same day, right? So what I have found over the years is that you see trafficking survivors in civil cases and they testify because it's their case. And it's like they've grown 3 feet, right? They go up on this stand, they give their testimony, and it's so empowering because it's really their case, it's what they're doing, it's their choice, and they get to choose whether to proceed or whether to settle.
So I'm interested to learn more about your clients and you know, how they get to you and sort of like, what's that process like? You know, I come to you because I want some kind of representation and I'm a victim of trafficking. What's the process that they go through to do that? And about how many clients do you handle, would you say, about a year?
So we do very little litigation ourselves, a very tiny amount ourselves. We're really more a bridge between non-governmental organizations that handle cases and pro bono lawyers. And then Alex has created databases, and so the databases of cases, we use those to do technical assistance to the lawyers that we assign the cases to. So the normal procedure is a trafficking victim, whether it's sex or labor, will go to an NGO and get social services. And then that NGO will come to us and say, you know, who's the best pro bono lawyer that you can find to bring this person's case or to represent this person in a criminal case. So then I'll look at the database and figure out sort of which lawyers are available and which are good and who has the capacity to represent certain kinds of victims in certain kinds of cases. And then I'll go to that law firm and say, you know, will you take this case? And the great thing is that a lot of the pro bono lawyers that we work with are actually former federal prosecutors. And so they understand trafficking because they have prosecuted these cases and they understand the role of the victim and the vulnerability of the victim and the danger of material witness warrants because they've actually seen all of that up close, excuse me, as prosecutors. So once the connection is made between the trafficking survivor and the law firm, we take a step back. The last thing a trafficking survivor needs to do is tell their story 50 times over, right? So
Sure.
the NGOs are doing the vetting, and then we sort of pair them up with the law firm. And then our interaction, by and large, is with the lawyers who are trying to to litigate the case. So we'll give them, you know, whatever they need to succeed. There are cases where, you know, where it's in court locally, there are cases where we'll actually attend the trial as well. So Alex recently attended a trial. My colleagues and I attended a trial in the Eastern District of Virginia, which was a daunting case where a trafficking victim had been held in domestic servitude in Yemen by a State Department official and her husband. She
Wow.
was actually working at the U.S. Embassy in Yemen. And while she was at work every day, her husband, who was retired, would stay home and rape the domestic worker. And so that case was never prosecuted. And so the victim came forward. We found counsel for her with Jones Day, another big law firm, and they brought that case, and a jury awarded her $3 million, right? Which is important, particularly where there's no accountability, where there's no criminal prosecution. So we were all in court and sort of providing on-site real-time technical assistance in that case. And that case went up on appeal as well to the Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals, and the law firm defended the verdict and won. So these are cases where you need really significant legal muscle, and these firms are willing to provide that legal muscle pro bono. It's all free.
That's amazing. So can you tell me about your staff? How many staff are at HT Legal, and sort of what does everyone do there?
Right. So we're a very small organization. We like to think we punch above our weight. So you've already heard from Alex Levy-Yelderman, who's our senior staff attorney. And Alex literally invented our databases. And so we have a civil case database and a criminal case database. And those are sort of useful for two reasons. One, they allow us to provide a lot of technical assistance to lawyers. Like if a lawyer is trying to write a particular motion, we can say, here are 5 other ones that other lawyers wrote that we think are good, that might be useful. DOJ calls them go-bys. So they might be good go-bys that you can use this to go by. But the databases have a more fundamental purpose as well, which is doing the research and spotting the horrible missteps in these cases, the mistakes and the failings of the criminal legal system. So that's one piece. So Alex is our senior staff attorney and does a lot of the research and writing. She wrote the report on mandatory restitution that found that only 27% of cases end with compensation for victims. And she also co-wrote the piece on material witness warrants that JWF sponsored. Sarah Bessel is my deputy director. Sarah basically runs our international programs, and so she has done training for lawyers in 11 countries around the globe, training lawyers on how to bring cases in U.S. courts. Because part of the purpose of this is to educate lawyers on the ground abroad that there's actually jurisdiction to bring cases in U.S. courts. And those cases can be brought on behalf of victims against American defendants here. So Sarah does that, but she also helps supervise our law fellows. We have a lot of law fellows. We have 2, one from Columbia Law School and one from Harvard Law School coming on deck this summer. So Sarah also supervises them. We have a third staff member named Anasuya Sayam, and Anasuya is an Indian-trained lawyer. So she's not a lawyer here in the US, but she's worked as a lawyer in India, and she's working on our trade work. And so it's possible to block goods made with forced labor from entering the US market. So she's working on making sure that children who are held in forced labor and adults held in forced labor abroad who are creating goods for US market, that those goods never make it to the US market. And then we have Shayna Horwitz, who's our wonderful development and communications director. And she actually attended your luncheon last year. I was so sad the luncheon couldn't go forward this year.
I know, we missed you, but we were happy to have Shayna.
Yes, it was great that Shayna could go. So Shayna got to meet a lot of your folks there. And then the last person is Roxy Farrow. And Roxy is our head of operations, but Roxy also has engaged in a really innovative project called our Survivor Leadership Seminar. So she has designed and managed and created a series of webinars for survivors to be responsive to issues that the survivors are raising. So the next one, which is tomorrow, which is for survivors only, is on how to write a book. So it's taught by a survivor on how to write your own story. And another survivor, Stacy Jewell, recently did a webinar for us, which was fantastic, on how to deal with the media. Because I think trafficking survivors have a terrible time knowing what it's safe to say to a journalist. So Roxy is herself a trafficking survivor and has worked in the field of trafficking for a very long time, and is managing and running this whole survivor leadership seminar.
Wow. Sounds like you have quite a powerhouse team there.
They're really good. We're really happy to have such a wonderful team.
So I just want to remind everyone, if you have a question, please submit it through the Q&A feature at the bottom. We did get a question that came through from Marlene, who's one of our trustees. So Marlene's question, she would like to know about the Jeffrey Epstein case. And she says, it seems that enablers have gotten off without prosecutions, and are there any avenues left to pursue these people? And I guess there's a Netflix documentary airing this week about Jeffrey Epstein. So Martina or Alex, either one.
Good.
So why don't I start, and then Alex can pick up, because I know Alex has been watching this one carefully as well. So the Epstein case is really fascinating because, you know, at bottom, that case is about the federal government failing victims, right? Because the federal prosecutors cut a deal with Epstein and gave immunity to all of the alleged co-conspirators. And it wasn't until Paul Castle, who's a wonderful lawyer, former federal judge, who turned his attention full-time to sex trafficking litigation. It wasn't until Paul Castle and a group of lawyers representing the victim actually brought a case challenging the federal government. So it wasn't a case at first against Jeffrey Epstein. It was a case challenging the plea deal. And so that case is proceeding, and Julie Brown, the reporter at the Miami Herald, who really brought this case back from the doldrums, right? It had been too long ignored, and then she started writing about it all the time and brought it back to the level of prominence that it should have. So the criminal case litigation is brought under a kind of victims' rights statute. So they're challenging the criminal case. On top of that, there are a number of civil cases that have been brought against Epstein and against co-conspirators. Those are all in the civil database. Alex, I don't know if you want to comment briefly on the civil cases. One thing to know about the civil cases against actual defendants is there's a 10-year statute of limitations. So Jeffrey Epstein was up to so much horrendous criminal behavior for so long that some of those acts have timed out under the statute of limitations. But Alex, do you want to add anything about the Epstein case?
No, I guess just to echo what you were saying about the kind of failure to protect victims and the fact that this is a great example of how civil litigation is the primary tool through which victims are able to, hopefully, to recover. Other than that, I think, you know, there's more and more cases being filed. I'm not sure. I think we have 6 or 7 in our database being filed against him and his estate also. So.
The other thing that's interesting about the Epstein cases that I'll just flag is that Epstein and his co-conspirators were so aggressive about going after the lawyers. And so this is something that we see now across the board in civil trafficking cases, is that the traffickers will file cases against the lawyers. And so in the Epstein case, one of the main lawyers representing victims was subjected to a brutal litigation against him on defamation charges. And I think he only just recently beat that case back. But it's a way that traffickers then embroil the lawyers in having to defend themselves, which makes it so much harder.
So I have some questions about Florida. I'm sort of interested to see like what you can tell us about Florida. You know, we sort of hear this statistic, which I'm not entirely sure how it's arrived at, but that Florida is like number 3 in the United States for trafficking cases. So I would love to hear, you know, kind of what your thoughts are about that and just sort of what you know about Florida in general in terms of both sex trafficking, but also labor trafficking.
So every time I visit states, back in the day when I could visit states, I would always be introduced by someone who would say, here we are in, name the state, and our state is number 2 in the country for trafficking. And it cannot be that every single state is number 2, number 3. So I'm hugely suspicious of those kinds of markers. And it's also sort of not a place of honor that any state should aspire to, right? Like no state should want to be number 1 or number 2 in this area. So I'm wary about those statistics. One thing that Alex frequently is able to do is literally pull a roster of every single federal criminal case and every single civil case brought in a state. And the states that are hardest for us to do, and Alex, you should chime in, the ones that have the most cases are California, Texas, New York. And, you know, I'm not sure what Florida's numbers are. I can go back and check for you, but Florida has a large number of cases that are brought by the feds, but that's oftentimes a function of who the prosecutors are and what the prosecutors' priorities are, rather than an evidence of prevalence, right? It may be that you have a very good prosecutor. So until recently, unfortunately, she just left, you had a really excellent prosecutor named Barbara Martinez, who was in the Southern District of Florida, bringing lots of trafficking cases. And unfortunately, she just left to go into private practice. So she's going to be desperately, desperately missed. We've had meetings with Senator Rubio about trafficking in Florida. And one of the things that people may not realize is that Florida is also a hub for labor trafficking.
Right.
And so, partly because of the J-1 visas, there are a lot of J-1 visa holders who are in Florida who are vulnerable to exploitation. There was a big case in Florida involving young women who came from Kazakhstan thinking that they were going to work in a spa on a J-1 program, who were then put into forced prostitution and forced labor as masseuses and held in Florida. There's a terrible Florida case that's a bit dated at this point, but it was a child from Haiti who was brought to Florida and held as a restivic in a home. So literally held as a child slave in a home in Florida. So there are forced labor cases as well as sex trafficking cases in Florida. The sex trafficking cases tend to get a lot more attention. But Alex, do you want to add anything about Florida? We haven't run the dockets on Florida recently, but Alex may remember.
Yeah, no, I mean, to echo 2 things that Martina has said. The first about trafficking being kind of a rigor-free zone. It is just, I think one of the most important things is to recognize what we can't quantify and what we can't know right now, which is really the prevalence of cases. And also the prevalence of prosecutions can't be used as a metric of the prevalence of trafficking, and not least because we you know, advocate for those who advocate for more aggressive prosecution. You know, that in effect would be counted against the states if that were considered a proxy for how often trafficking is happening. So I think the answer to the question is just, we don't know, we can't know, and it's really important to acknowledge that in terms of the numbers.
Sure. So we had a question that came in. So Sarah Cohen, she's actually an attorney who works for Legal Aid in Palm Beach County. So Sarah's question is that you mentioned federal cases, and she wants to know if your database follows cases on the statewide level.
You know, so Sarah, first of all, it's great to see you. So what you may not know, there's a history here. So when I spoke at the JWF luncheons several years ago, Sarah organized an opportunity for me to train the legal aid staff in Palm Beach. So I got to train the legal aid staff thanks to Sarah's efforts. So Sarah and I have visited several times when she's been in Washington. So Sarah, it's great to see that you're on the call. So unfortunately, we have tried to create a 50-state database as well, so that we're not just looking at federal prosecutions, we're looking at state prosecutions. And the states are so, I hate to say disorganized, maybe I should be gentle and say disaggregated, right? So the problem is that every single county, in some cases every single city, has its own docketing system. So we found a pro bono attorney that was willing to do this for California for us. And they called us back after agreeing to do it and said, we realize that we are going to have to send a lawyer to every single little county courthouse in the entire state in order to create this database. So we haven't been able to do it. We haven't been able to get that done. But I think it is fair to say that most of the really important cases have been brought in federal courts. That's changing a little bit because all the states are now adopting trafficking laws, and all the states are now permitting civil cases to be brought as well.
So, Martina, and I guess also for Alex, I mean, so you both had been working around this issue for a long time, and it's certainly a pretty challenging topic, I would say, and I think that it can be overwhelming a lot of the time when you're working on really awful topics like this. So I'm curious to know, through the span of years that you have been working around trafficking, like, do you see things getting better in any way? And if you do, in what way do you see things maybe getting better?
So it's such a good question because I think it can be daunting. And Alex reads all of the transcripts for the trials. And I think the trial transcripts testimony can be really difficult to go through, and
Sure.
Certainly go through cases, the testimony live is even more daunting. But my focus, and I think all of our focus, is on the wins, right? So we really try very hard to focus on the wins, and there are a lot of wins. We were just talking this morning back and forth, and we just tweeted about, so you should follow us on Twitter. We just tweeted about an important case in the United States brought by federal prosecutors, where a woman in New Jersey held a domestic worker in her home for 9 years, paid her nothing. She was in forced labor, taking care of 3 children, doing all of the cooking, all the cleaning, forced to sleep in a public area. And that case was prosecuted. Case was prosecuted, which is a huge win. And even better than that, I mean, we're like broken records when we talk to the Department of Justice. We're always asking them for restitution. And in this case, the restitution to that victim was $1.2 million, right? That's just her back wages. So that's a huge win. We also had another win recently when I took Alex's report on mandatory restitution, the report that Alex wrote on mandatory restitution, and we met with Judge Emmett Sullivan. Judge Sullivan, who's currently famous because he has the Flynn case, but Judge Sullivan should actually be famous in the District of Columbia for something else, which is he wrote one of the best restitution orders ever, awarding 4 child victims of sex trafficking with $3.8 million in restitution in a criminal case. And so Judge Sullivan sent a copy of our report to all of his colleagues, saying this is, there should be restitution in every case. So I do see light at the end of the tunnel. I see more cases of compensation for victims. When we always send the Department of Justice advance copies of our reports so that they're not shocked and stunned and when they get press calls. And when we sent them a copy of the material witness warrant report that Alex and Henry Wu, our legal fellow, wrote on, and it's really all sex trafficking victims who are held, they said everybody was out. So there were no victims being held at the moment. So, we have to take the wins.
Sure.
At the same time focusing on sort of bigger systems change. And the bigger systems change comes from sort of strategic litigation and comes from the kind of advocacy that we're doing with DOJ.
Sure. And I think that your organization is a really good example of social change, which, we talk about all the time because that's really what JWF is focused on. But I know that sometimes it's difficult to understand like what we mean by social change. So I think that what you're doing is a really good example of demonstrating that even though it takes time for us to get there, that we we do see changes happening, whether it's on a policy level or in terms of attitudes around a particular issue. So can you tell us a little bit more about the advocacy aspect of what you're doing?
Yeah, the one thing I would add to just an answer to the last question as well is, there's a huge survivor movement now, right? I mean, we have someone who's on staff who's running a program for other survivors, but all the speakers in the survivor series are other survivors. And so they're also in a place kind of like the domestic violence movement, but we're also in a place where there's a real survivor movement and real power, I think, behind survivors who are running programs now. So on the advocacy front, I mean, one thing that we really pushed, and we put this in our press release, is there shouldn't be any material witness warrant victims in prison, period. Not just during COVID, but anytime. And so, we're continuing to push the Department of Justice to just not use material witness warrants for trafficking victims. There are other ways that you can work with trafficking victims to assure their testimony in a criminal case. I mean, one of them is getting them a lawyer, right? So the material witness report, one of the recommendations that we make in that report is that every trafficking victim should have a lawyer, right? And particularly children, right? It's such a no-brainer. And so that's another area. And we're starting to see some movement now where, people who are in our network of pro bono lawyers will contact a U.S. Attorney's Office and say, we saw that you filed this new indictment. We're concerned about the victims in this case. And the U.S. Attorney's Offices, the victim witnesses units, will talk to local NGOs about supporting the victims. So we are seeing sort of more victim-centered work. Mm-hmm. We hope that victim-centered work, and we're working to make that victim-centered approach encompass lawyers as well, so that people have lawyers to represent them in these cases. And then on the other advocacy side, we've been very public about significant concerns that we have, particularly for foreign-born victims in the United States. And so the Human Trafficking Legal Center doesn't take any government money at all, which means that we have freedom to speak in a way that a lot of organizations who are terrified that they would lose their funding can't. And so when the administration started essentially undermining the visa program that allows allows trafficking victims to receive special visas to remain in the United States. When that system started to, I won't say collapse, but because it hasn't collapsed, but when there were policies that started undermining those protections, we were able to go out very publicly and very quickly and just say that this was wrong. So that's a level of advocacy that I think we're free to do because we have donors who support us, and we're not terrified about a major cut.
Right. Yeah. So going back to the trafficking victims, particularly the children, I'm sort of interested to know what the profile is for these trafficking victims, if there is one. Do they come from different backgrounds? Do you think that there are particular demographics that are maybe more vulnerable than others? What can you tell us about those victims?
Can I take?
Please do.
Yeah. So in the sex trafficking cases, I think without exception, the victims come from turbulent backgrounds. And when I say without exception, of the cases where you can glean these things from the docket, from the record, it's very, very, very common to see that they are runaways. Sometimes they're coming from foster care. Sometimes they're in juvenile facilities. I've read thousands of cases, and I have yet to see one where someone from a stable environment is kidnapped. Kidnapped out of their backyard. And the populations, there's, I guess, some variation, but there's actually very powerful uniformity in that they're coming from backgrounds where they don't have anybody protecting them, essentially.
And in terms of the gender makeup Would you say that it's generally girls we're talking about?
I mean, again, the cases that I can speak to are the ones that are prosecuted, the subset of prosecuted cases that have open records. Certainly we see the vast majority are girls of the cases in that respect.
Although one thing that I would add, Jennifer, is that there was just a civil case that was brought in Connecticut that involved male victims who all had some sort of intellectual or addiction disability. And so some of the research that we've done that has been pretty devastating, and we only recognized it because of the databases that Alex built. What we've recognized is that some number of the victims, we can't quantify it because not every case, as Alex says, contains this level of detail, but
Sure.
some number of victims have developmental disabilities and intellectual disabilities. And so the traffickers are quite strategic to target children who have these disabilities. And where it's an adult with a disability, the traffickers will sometimes recruit people for their Social Security disability income. So they'll recruit people with SSDI. They'll collect the SSDI for themselves. And then as additional income, they'll force the victim into forced labor or forced prostitution.
Mm.
The other thing I should just very quickly is one of the things that Alex has identified and that we're working on as our next report is, I think, what would loosely be called corruption. We're really starting to delve now into cases where there is police involvement in the trafficking, or children are trafficked out of state institutions by state employees. For example, children in care homes who are trafficked by the foster care, group home care staff into the sex industry. And then we're also looking at cases that follow the profile so disturbing in Arizona, a case that just broke in Lake Havasu, Arizona, where HSI agents, those are agents of the Department of Homeland Security, a subset of ICE. Those are the agents who are supposed to be doing criminal cases to stop trafficking. And the court records indicate that some of those agents actually had sex, commercial sex that they paid for with taxpayer money during an investigation. So they were, as part of their investigation, alleged to have had commercial sex with people that they considered victims. Mm. Right? So again, the failure of the criminal justice system is legion, and the research piece of this is to point out what people's real experiences are. Right? This is not a justice system on a white horse, you know, a knight in shining armor coming to rescue small child victims who then sort of are grateful and thrilled. It's much more complicated than that.
Sure. Sure. So we have about 5 minutes left. So I did want to ask, I mean, what do you think, if anything, those of us who are listening on the call can do to be helpful in any way around these issues?
So I think, one thing to do is to, follow us on, follow our postings on Facebook or on Twitter, because we're trying to, as Alex put it, like add rigor to the field, right? We're trying to sort of put information into the world that is based in reality and based in serious intellectual research looking at the system. The second thing is keep doing what you're doing, because all of the support that all of your supporters give to JWF, all of the donations to JWF that are then sent to organizations doing work on the ground with children in foster care or girls who are vulnerable to trafficking, or to, and frankly, also to us. JWF's support for organizations like ours is just incredibly important. And so we can't thank you enough, your board members and your supporters, all the people who go to your wonderful luncheon. The fact that JWF gives us the freedom to be critical that funding from JWF gives us the ability to do this research and to provide legal services to these trafficking survivors is really important. So I think what everybody can do is support JWF.
Well, thank you for saying that. And I mean, really, we should be thanking you because you are out there, on the front lines and doing all this amazing work. So I really appreciate everything that you and your team are doing.
Thank you.
We're, of course, happy to support what you're doing. So, yeah, thank you again. And thank you for being on this webinar with us. We did have one question that came in, and someone is asking about how you find victims if they're not reported by social workers.
So sometimes people will contact us directly. We have an information box and people can send us blind emails. And so sometimes we get blind emails. Some of those cases are things that we can place and some of them aren't. But one of the things that we're very, very adamant about is that people need social workers. People need a social network and support before they can get a lawyer. Lawyers are really bad at social work. And so we want to make sure that people have all of their sort of most basic needs met. And then it's easier to work with a lawyer. The other way that cases come in is sometimes directly through law enforcement, when law enforcement will recognize that someone is a lawyer.
Well, thank you so much. So if any of our participants would like to learn more about the organization, Martina, what is the best way to do that?
So you can go to our website, which is www.htlegalcenter.org. And you can follow us on Twitter at @HTLegalCenter. And follow us on Facebook. Those are sort of the main places that we post information, particularly the heavy hitting reports, but then also updates on cases where things can be made happen.
Great. Well, thank you so much for being with us, Alex and Martina. I hope you're both staying safe
and
doing as well as can be. It was lovely to see you. Hopefully we'll get to see you in person at some point in the future.
So next year in Florida, if not in Jerusalem.
Yeah, that would be great.
Thanks, guys. Take care.
All right. Thanks, Alex and Martina.
Bye-bye.
And thank you again to everyone for being with us for another Impact Tuesdays. If you are interested in learning more about JWF's work or seeing info on our upcoming webinars, you can go to jwfpalmbeach.org. And just as a reminder, of course, we are 100% supported by individual donations and through our trustees. So if you are interested in supporting our work, you can certainly do that through our website. And we are, and for at least the rest of the week, we are running our COVID-19 recovery campaign, which donations that are made to the campaign will go to our 8 local grantees to help provide emergency funds to women and girls who are being especially impacted right now. So Impact Tuesdays moving forward is going to be every other Tuesday. I think that a lot of people are spending time virtually in meetings and in other webinars. And so to kind of respect everyone getting maybe a little bit of fatigue, we are going to start with every other week. And so the next Impact Tuesday we have will be 2 weeks from today, featuring Futures Without Violence. Look for our info about that on Facebook and an email. And as always, I hope that you are well and staying safe, and we will see you soon. Thanks.